Hey, this is Pastor Scott, and I'm bringing you another of the top questions that I get. Now, this is a little bit different because it isn't technically one of the top questions I get, but it is one of the most searched or Googled questions that people have. Now, I consider it one of my top questions because when I do any event on this, the Shroud of Turin, or I talk about it on the radio show, then we get a ton of questions. And it's also one of the most downloaded podcasts that I've had. And I don't even cover it in detail and it doesn't have pictures. So I thought, man, I need to do this for people and get this information out. Now, I think the reason why it isn't one of the most asked questions is because it's a little bit hinky, right? It just feels a little bit gimmicky. I'm not trying to be irreverent, but I remember when the topic of the shroud first came out in the late 70s when I was in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and it was a big deal here because some of the people who went from the United States, many of the scientists who went on the shroud research project came from New Mexico, as well as many of the equipment that they used to study it came from locally here from Albuquerque and Sandia Labs and the Los Alamos Labs and just north of Albuquerque. So it was a big deal, and I wasn't saved then, and I kind of heard about it, and I thought, those kind of quirky Catholics and their relics, but in the back of my mind, I was like, I need to be reverent about this, because what if it really is the Shroud of Jesus, but if somebody really wanted to know, they don't want to come out and say that they're really interested or they really 100% for it, because then it kind of labels you. And so even doing this on the internet, a lot of people don't like to do this, but I'm just going to give you my breakdown of what I studied. And I'm not going to tell you yes or no 100%, but I'm going to tell you at the end that what I think in a percentage. And I think that's fair. I can't prove it, or I don't think anybody can disprove it, but it's fascinating when you go through the shroud itself. And I've spent a lot of time studying this, and not just over the internet and watching other people. I've gone to seminars and seen mock-ups close up, and Dr. Jackson, who led the STIRP team there, I spent afternoon with him and went through a full seminar with him, went to lunch with him and his wife and spent time on this. So I've done a lot of research in this. And you know why? It's because I heard some of my heroes of the faith reference this, and I thought, oh, man, I need to take a second look, because if Gary Habermas talks about this being the fourth best evidence for the resurrection, or Dr. Norman Geisler says this is like the best evidence in the 20th century of a first century miracle, then I was like, I better check this out and not, dismiss it offhand. So I started digging in and saw some things. So let me go to Scripture and start off with Scripture. It's the best place to start, right? So Matthew 27:59. Then, when Joseph of Arimathea, had taken the body, he wrapped it in a clean linen cloth. So he's the one who brought the cloth and wrapped it. So we also see in John 20, verses 1 through 9, it says, "Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb early, and while it was still dark, and saw the stone had been taken away from the tomb. And she ran and came to Simon Peter and the other disciple whom Jesus loved, and said to them, 'They have taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they laid him.' And Peter therefore went out, and the other disciple, and were going to the tomb. So they both ran together, and the other disciple outran Peter and came to the tomb first. And he, stooping down and looking in, saw the linen cloths lying there, yet he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came following him and went into the tomb and saw the linen cloths lying there, and the handkerchief that had been around his head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded together in a place by itself. Then the other disciple who came to the first tomb, or came to the tomb first, went in also, and he saw and believed. For as of yet they did not know the scripture that he must rise again from the dead. So we see these scripture, and we see that there's a number of cloths that go along, but the main cloth, linen cloth, that's 14 feet long by 3.5 feet wide, and the shroud has a faint imprint of a human body that appears to be crucified. Now, a shroud cloth is a cloth they would use for burial, and it would wrap around the body. Oftentimes you would have a facial cloth that would go over the face, and then they would have the longer piece that would go around the body, and then they would have a small strip that would tie the shroud together, kind of also keep the hands and the feet together and keep the arms from not flopping out as you transported the body around. And something you can see here, look at the shroud, and this is the actual picture of the Shroud of Turin. And see how there's a seam that goes right up this left side here. And you can see from this that there's this seam that goes all the way the length of the shroud. And they believe that this is the linen cloth, that part of the cloths, because it talks about multiple cloths, and that there was a facial cloth, but this was the cloth that actually wrapped him. Matter of fact, we see that in John when it talks about Lazarus, John 11:43 through 44, it says, "Now when he had said these things, he cried in a loud voice, 'Lazarus, come forth.' And he who died came out bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was wrapped with a cloth. And Jesus said to him, 'Loose him and let him go.'" And we do see in John 27, it says, "In the handkerchief which had been around his head, not lying with the linen cloth, but it was folded together in a place by itself." So we see those three together with Jesus. Okay, so its location now is in Turin, Italy, and that's why it's called the Shroud of Turin. It's been called a number of different names because of the place it was either conveyed to or was being stored. And historically, we know for sure that documents place it from 1357 to present. In 1357, the shroud was shown publicly in Lille, France. And from there, it had some problems. They think that it was burned with a hot poker accidentally. Some believe that it was maybe a candle or another fire that was there. And we can see that. Let me bring it up close here. So you see these holes, and the shroud gets folded in half and then folded in half lengthwise, and it gets folded on itself. So you're going to see a number of things that are mirror images of each other, and that's because it was folded when the incident happened. But here you can see these 4 holes that they believe either was, they call them poker hole because it looks like a poker, but it was in another fire. And I say another fire because when it was moved from this place in France, Lille, France, that in 1532 it was in Chambéry, France, and there, 1532, there was a fire, a major fire in the chapel, and it was in a box, and the box caught fire, and there was major damage done to the shroud. And so you can see the fire and water damage by these arrows down here. That was, they're symmetrical because, again, it was folded. So these are where these holes are completely burned through, and then you can see the water damage in here, when they put out the fire on it. So you've got some major damage. And then at this time, late 1300s, 1400s, they put a back on it. That's why you can't see through it, but they put a backing onto the shroud. and they sewed it into it. So you had a newer backing to the shroud. It never had a backing before. So from this time, it became famous, really famous, in 1898 when Segunda Pia got permission to photograph the shroud. And what he found out was that it produced a negative image, right? So actually, it was a negative image, right? Then when he took a picture of it, the negative image actually appeared like the picture. So it was reversed from the process he normally expected, right? He usually received a negative, and then from there he produced a realistic picture. And the shroud had the kind of characteristics and principles in itself of being a negative image. And then when he took the picture and viewed the negative, it looked like a regular picture, if you're following what I'm saying. And so that's when it kind of really took off and people were astonished at what was going on. It was debated back and forth, is this the real thing? So in 1978, a group of scientists got permission to go study the shroud for 5 days. And it's called the STURP Project because it's short for Shroud of Turin Research Project. And 34 scientists went, 26 Americans, and all converged there in Turin, Italy. And at this time, there were about half had some kind of belief in God, but only about 4 considered themselves evangelical Christians. So the vast majority of scientists were skeptics. Matter of fact, they thought they would get there, many of them thought they'd get there in 30 minutes, prove that this is not a real thing, it's a fake, and they thought within 30 minutes we'll be able to determine how the shroud was made and prove that it isn't a burial cloth of Christ at all and disprove this whole thing. And they were serious. They took 80 crates of equipment to study this. And the leader of this project, Dr. John Jackson, is the one I spent time with and got much of this information, as well as other sites and sites from some of the other scientists that were there. So they did all kinds of research. They, like CSI at the time, they took surface fibers on tape. They took all kinds of pictures. They actually found real blood on it. And I just wanted to point out here that if you can see in this picture, and let me amplify it, where they pulled up blood, it was white and clean underneath, which meant that the image was after the blood. So the blood went on first, and whatever produced the image came secondarily. And so when the blood was pulled off, it showed unaffected, clean linen below it, which means that there was an order of transference, that whatever happened, if it was copied or whatever, somebody laid down blood first and then did, if it's some kind of forgery, then they did their forgery, which is kind of unusual. It would be highly unusual, wouldn't it? But it's just something that's really crazy. So there was a Swiss criminologist, Max Fry, who came along in 1986. He took, or before that actually, took all kinds of samples with tape dispenser like they do in crime scenes investigation, and they pull up whatever they can off the surface, whether it be, whatever was lying on it, whether it be pollen or dust or, microbes or anything that was there that the tape would lift off, then that's what he did. And he took it of the entire shroud. In 1986, that was turned over to the STURP team, or at least they got access to it. And then they took literally thousands and thousands of photos, 30,000 plus photos of every inch of the shroud. And they took all kinds of types of photos, anything from front lighting to back lighting to black lighting to super magnification. They just went crazy. They used almost every known type of imaging at the time. And one of the imaging techniques they used, they came back and it's called VP8 imaging. Now, this was imaging that NASA used because they wanted to check out the moon and the craters, and they wanted to see how deep it was. And so it was something that VP8 imaging looks at qualities from a black and white, but can, or from any photo. If it's a 3D object, then the light has different intensity reflecting back. And from that, it can show you the terrain and how high something is. And it shows you, it gives you three-dimensionality from a two-dimensional picture if the picture was of something that was three-dimensional. And so this is an example of the VP8 imaging. But look what it did with the Shroud of Turin. And the images taken of the Shroud of Turin is that it actually gives you a three-dimensional view of a face, which this does not occur on just a picture of a face. If you take a picture of a face and you print it out and use VP8 imaging, it doesn't give you this three-dimensionality of it. This only occurs if the object gave you a three-dimensional reflection back of different intensity of light. So it's pretty amazing when you look at this. So people try to say this is a painting, this is scorch marks, different ways that a forger could have made the Shroud of Turin. It's not any of those, but let's go through those and kind of examine what could it be. See, they can't actually tell you what the shroud is because the image on the shroud is just on the very surface of the shroud, the very surface fibers of the shroud, and it's cellulose. It's not a painting. So when they look at it up close, there's no paint on any of the fibers. Now, is there paint on the shroud? There is some iron oxide and animal protein binder, which would be, basically a description of old-time paint or paint back in those days. But it's tiny, small amounts that are kind of specks that are distributed around the shroud. It's not the image. It's not on the image. It wasn't used for the image. But it tells you that this image was at one time or another, or multiple times, painted that on another canvas, and these flecks went from that canvas and in the air and landed on the shroud. But it's not in any kind of clustering or, you can't see brush strokes. Nobody applied it directly to the shroud. And you can look at close-up images. You can see in the shroud that some of the darker images and where you would think paint would soak through or would glob, you can see it's just fibers. It's just discolored fibers. There's no paint on the shroud at all. No pigments, no dyes, no stains found, no brush strokes found. So this is just something that's amazing. Now, here's a reproduction, or actually a copy. In 1620, they did a copy of the shroud, a painting of it, and this is what a painting would look like. And you can clearly see, you can see right away it's not the same as the shroud. And so if you look at the shroud and compare it with this painting, you'll see the aspects of them differ quite a bit. Now, is there a similar image? Sure, but the rest of it just doesn't fit under a VP8 analyzer. It doesn't pop or give you ridges. On the shroud, there's no directionality to the image like you would with brush strokes, or even with iron oxide. If you take magnets and iron, you can get directionality. There's nothing like that on the shroud. And the shroud has perfect anatomical details, which kind of it's more like a photo than a painting. Also, it has real blood on it. And so it just seems weird that, and it goes on first. So it would just seem just astounding that a forger could forge this, put real blood on it, and then figure out the negative aspect of the shroud, and then paint around the blood to make the body and make it fit. It just would be an amazing thing. So it's not a painting at all. Well, some say it's a scorch mark or it's like a burn mark. And they use the idea of that you can take metal, heat it up, not rock, but metal if you heat it up, and some rocks, but metal will give you a little more detail. You heat it up and you can make an image on cloth. And if you look at it, you're like, okay, you can kind of make an image, but the shroud is not a scorch mark. The image is only going to be made on the fibers that are in contact with the hot metal. But in the shroud, you can see that there are areas that are much lighter and there's almost no image on, but in the depth or lower parts of the fibers is the darker image. And it wouldn't have been in direct contact with a hot piece of metal or rock. And so it doesn't fit. You can also see that, and on the left here, I'm giving you a view of somebody who tried to make an image on, the cloth as near as they could to the shroud, and the cloth that is in a herringbone weave like the shroud. But you can see that scorching usually mats the fibers and oftentimes leave burn marks and clusters on fibers. And you see none of that on the shroud. It's just cellulose. The shroud has no burn marks, but it's a cellulose that's impregnated just the top layer of the fibers. It's not a scorch mark at all. Well, some would say then it's made by contact, prolonged contact and pressure, like you would with a leaf in a book. And you take a leaf, you've probably done this, put it in a book and put a lot of pressure on it, other books on it, and you leave it over time. You have to leave it for a while, quite a while, matter of fact. And you can get an image, though, and you can get some fairly detailed images off of that. And because it's actually imprinted on the paper and the paper will bend and the fibers will bend a little bit, you can get VP8 imaging from that. So, hey, could it be contact? The problem with this is that it doesn't really leave the negative image, and that there's parts of the body are imaged on the shroud that would not have come in contact with the shroud. We don't see quite the resolution in this contact transference that you do from the shroud. Whatever you have that you're putting in contact, that will usually permeate the paper in this pressure contact system, but that didn't happen with the shroud. When you put an image in a book and you put a whole bunch of books on top of that, the weight gets distributed to the item. If you have something really thin, it works, but if you have something thicker, what happens is the back flattens out quite a bit, and you get a much smaller detailed image on the front, but the back is very blurred and flattened because of the distribution of weight, right? So you see what I'm following? So if you have in the book the second page where the image would be very flat and not very detailed, but the top would be. If you have something that is anything thicker than like a leaf, right? So it doesn't really work with the body at all. So what is the shroud? I mean, it doesn't seem like it's produced, seems like the real deal, but something happened. We see that they did a scientific dating of the shroud, and they got permission to go in and take part, and this is an actual picture of them cutting part of the edge of the shroud out. And then they sent this to 3 different universities or different scientists. One, the University of Arizona, University of Oxford, the Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, and they each did a carbon-14 testing on it, because carbon-14 can be absorbed into plants, and then if you eat the plants, it's absorbed in your body. And then through the beta decay, you're going to have carbon-14 decaying at a certain rate. And if you see what that rate is. If you know what that rate is, then you can kind of have a clock on it. It's not absolute, but you can have a clock on it and say, hey, this is the date of this item when it came into being. This is how old it is. And so they came out with a test of 1260 to 1390. And so people raise their hands. That's it. It's over. We've proved it. It's not a first century shroud, and that's done. And so people came along and said, well, that's terrible. That's, it's a conspiracy. Well, I don't think it's a conspiracy. I think you need to follow the evidence and go through. I really don't think that these people were ill-natured towards the shroud. I think they sent it to 3 different labs so that they could be above reproach. And so, but there are things that can happen here. And so, look, what we've been looking at is astonishing. And so, if you have something, let's say you were investigating a crime, and the evidence really started pointing towards one person, it starts to be overwhelming. Look, this fits the bill. This guy did it, but he has a pretty good alibi. He wasn't there at the time. He has a videotape of him somewhere else when the crime was committed. Should you throw up your hands and go, nah, it's over with then? Or if all the evidence points to that individual, should you look very seriously at the alibi? For example, a good detective would go back and say, is this video with a timestamp absolute? Could this have been filmed any other time? Could it have been altered? Could this timestamp be incorrect? Could it be a thing of mistaken identity? Are there other circumstances that would change the video or change the timestamp, like an electricity surge or somebody getting in and altering it? And if any of those could be proven, or if you had serious doubts about that, if you went and investigated it and they said, yeah, we are susceptible to surges and electrical surges, and we don't have a surge protector on it, and when it does, it can drastically change the time, and if we don't catch it or know that, then the timestamp will be off. And so it could be that this guy was there, but not at the time that the crime was committed. So are there any things that would throw off carbon-14 dating? Well, you can get a rogue sample, and there's some times where they go in and date something and they know it's off, but they can't tell you why. It just is rogue. For example, here is a horn that is a Viking horn. It's dated about 2000 AD using carbon-14 testing. Okay. And then here's a picture of a snail still alive, and they took samples of the snail and of his shell and dated it 26,000 years old. Well, that's a rogue sample. How is that off? They don't know, but sometimes these things are off. But they do know that certain things will throw off carbon-14 dating. And here's one of the examples that Dr. Garza Valdez of Texas, he found on the Shroud of Turin that it has a bioplastic coating, and he's demonstrated that carbon-14 cleaning, or the testing, when they go in and they test it, they clean it, that it doesn't remove this bacteria. And so you have this micro barrier of bacteria that can be put on there through contamination, being handled, and they know it was handled extensively in the 14th century because the entire thing was handled and repaired after the fire, and a backing was put on it. And so he says he's proven that this can throw the data off by at least 1,000 years. So that's one idea. I don't know for sure if that is, but that starts throwing like the timestamp on the video that this could be off. And Sue Benford and Joseph Marino, they looked at this and they said, exactly where the sample was taken for carbon-14 testing is right where all the repairs were. And we actually look at this area and you can see microfibers that this is where some of the new stuff was added with the old stuff, because there was end-to-end repairs where the fibers, you can see fibers coming from one side and fibers coming another side, were twisted together. And that's right where they took the samples. And so the sample they used, even if they cleaned it well and did other things, it may be contaminated with the fibers from the repair, and that would give you a date that was right around the repair. And so that's their theory on that. But just like the video, if you ask them what could throw off the dating on the video, well, electrical surge, something happened, a glitch with the computer, or something's going on with the actual software in the computer, it could throw off the timestamp. Well, can anything throw off carbon dating and its timestamp? Yeah, actually, they know for sure fire does. They know for sure water does. They know atmospheric pressure throws it off. And look, the shroud's been subject to all three of those. So fire, when you burn something, you instantly get carbon, right? And so you've doubled or tripled or quadrupled the carbon that you had there before, because you burnt the item. And so we know that the Shroud of Turin's been subject to at least 2 fires, and that it was subject to water when they put out the fire, and you see the water stains on it. We also know that in modern times that they put it in a pitcher container type of thing and subjected it to vacuum and to different atmospheric pressure, trying to preserve the shroud. Could it be from a forger from that time? It could be, but nobody can explain how it was forged. And there's real doubt on, do they have an accurate carbon dating? And I'm not faulting them, because they didn't want the shroud, the Catholic Church didn't want the shroud all cut to pieces, right? They said, take it only from this corner. And the people who were overseeing it wanted to take it from various places, because they knew this was an option. They could, if they did that, then they would have more control over the test. And but if you take it from one corner, if that one corner was compromised, then you're no matter how many laboratories you send your fabric to, it's all going to come back the same, and so the whole sample's tainted, right? If it is tainted, can we prove that the shroud was sometime before the 14th century that the carbon dating kind of puts it into? And actually, yeah, there are other references to the shroud from early on. For example, it was also called the Mandalion, which is or the image of Edessa, and there's a painting here of the tradition that Jude Thaddeus took it to King Abgar, who was sick, and when he saw it, he believed that it was the image of Christ on this long piece of cloth. And that doesn't depict it very well in this painting, but it tries to depict a face on this piece of cloth. And this king was healed, so the legend goes, right? This is around 544. And because this was such a great thing and impacted the king and the people, that they actually stored this in the gate of the city, and once a year they would uncover it. Once a year they would uncover the shroud and let people see it. And so here's a picture in 544 AD of them uncovering the shroud, which was in the wall of the gate of the city. Now remember, before this time, that any images of Jesus were of him as like David, image of David, or of this real masculine individual, the shepherd who looks like Adonis. But after this time, we see that the images that start appearing and everything look so much like the shroud, that the depictions of Christ change drastically from this Adonis shepherd type of character to a individual that looks so much like the shroud. This is the icon from St. Catherine's Monastery. This is circa 550. And you can see the striking image of that to the shroud, the elongated nose, the beard that you only see part of the image, but it looks like the beard was like wrapped in, hair parted in the middle, hair in the left side, or excuse me, would be the right side, would be tucked back behind the shoulder. The hair on the left side is resting on the shoulder, the elongated nose, the owl-like eyes we talked about. And so the depictions are crazy when you look at that. This is a Pantocrator icon from St. Catherine's Monastery. This is circa 550. So let's look at the image again, kind of close, and see how much it's changed. Now we'll put it side by side, and you'll see the facial features right there again, right? Very distinct in this. And we'll go to another picture side by side. You see the elongated face, the bulbous nose, the view of the hair, again, on the right side tucked back, on the left side to the front. And it's just amazing what you begin to see on the images in that. Matter of fact, it changes drastically, not just on pictures and mosaics, but also frescoes and coins. Here's some of the coins that were circulating around 600 AD. And look at the image of the shroud. Look at the image that you see on the coins. And these are coins that are of Jesus because the inscription reads on the coin, Jesus Christ, King of Kings. And you again can see the owl-like eyes, the elongated nose, the hair tucked back on the right, on the shoulder on the left. And it's stunning. And let's look at the another thing here. This is the image of Edessa, also known as the shroud. It is now seen in 944 AD. This is later on that it shows up in a painting when it arrives at Constantinople. And they were considered the stage of Christianity and then therefore the caretakers of the relics of Christianity. And we can see that it's received, and there's the image of the king receiving it and him putting his face on the face that's an image on the shroud. And you can see it's not a painting. It's actually a shroud that is folded up multiple times, and that's how the shroud was stored and transported at the time. And then we see again something this is amazing. In 1195, there's a Hungarian codex which the monks used as their prayer index, a prayer book, and this is now in the Budapest National Library. But you can see a rendition of what would be Jesus being buried and the shroud covering him as he's being buried. And so it's a depiction of the burial cloth. And let me get a close-up of this, and you can see that they had Jesus. He was being buried, his arms folded. You see the marks in his wrist. And on this slide, though, you can see that they have a picture of the unusual herringbone kind of weave pattern, which was super expensive at the time. It's very time-consuming, and usually only rich had it. But notice something else, okay, right in this area. Notice this. I'm going to go to the next slide. What does that remind you of? And here's a close-up picture of the codex from 1195. And you see the poker marks, which is the other fire that burned holes in the shroud, which looks like a poker. And so that's in that picture. Let me back up. So look at this. So they're presenting this burial of Jesus. He's being put into this. When you take a close-up of this, you get the herringbone pattern, and you get it's not just any canvas or any fabric. It's a fabric that resembles the shroud in just amazing detail, right? They wouldn't guess this unless they'd seen it firsthand. So when we're looking through this, if you were saying, what's the evidence that this is Christ? It goes on probability, doesn't it? So if you have a probability of one thing happening or one description, the more you can describe something in detail, the more it is authenticated. For example, like if you're going to, a big car show, and there's a bunch of car advocates and collectors that come, and their cars aren't necessarily in the show, but they're there, and you're walking up, and this guy gets out and his car goes into the VIP area, and he drops $100 bill out of his wallet, and you pick it up, and being the good individual you are, you don't pocket it, but you go to the VIP counter and you go, hey, I don't have the guy's name, but I know the car he was driving. If you would find that car, then you would know by number who the individual was, and when he comes out to get his car, you can give his $100 back. And so the attendant goes, okay, I can't let you in, but I'll go in to the area. Can you describe his car? And I'll send you a picture back of the car, I think, and then you tell me if that's the car, and then we'll match the numbers, and I'll give him his money back. So you say, okay, it's a blue Ford sedan, 2 doors. And so the guy sends a picture. Is this it, right? So what are the chances? Well, how many blue cars are there? And how many of them are Fords, and how many are only 2-door, right? Well, 1 in 50, 1 in 100, depending on how many people are there. And so he says, this car? And you go, no, it's much older. The guy's a car enthusiast. He drove in with a bunch of old cars, so it's probably sitting near old cars. It was old. It had side runners. It had a thin metal bumper, and it had a sticker on the windshield. And the guy says, is this it? And you're like, well, no. I mean, that's close. That's amazingly close because, yeah, it has a sticker and has chrome in its grill and stuff. But I'm talking about a car that had all chrome, not part chrome. It was all chrome, and it had reflectors on the bumper. And so the guy takes another picture and he goes, is this it? And you go, oh, man, I can't believe you keep finding cars that are close to this, but you can't have too many cars left that fit this description. Look, the sticker is yellow, and it's in the driver's side. I remember that. And the bumper only had 2 strips of chrome, and it had reflectors on it, but the reflectors were blue, and it had something really unusual that makes it stand out. It had yellow hubcaps, yellow wheel hubs, I should say, and then it had like bug-eye headlights. And the guy says, is this it? And you go, that's it. That's the one. And he goes, good, because there's not another car like this in the entire parking lot. This had better be it. So he gets him his $100 back, right? Why would you give the $100 back? Because you're like, oh, come on. There can't be 2 people with identical cars that have dropped $100, right? So this has to be the car. And you feel very confident in giving that $100 back to that individual. Well, could you use the same thing with the shroud? We've got all this evidence, but there's even more evidence on this. So I know this is getting long, but this will blow your mind. So what other evidence do we have about the shroud? Well, we have a textile expert, John Tyrer. He is an expert in first century Palestinian and Syrian fabrics, and he says a 3-in-1 herringbone weave is not common at all in the 14th century. It was somewhat common in the 1st century, but it would have been very expensive, especially something that was exactly Jewish in measurement, meaning 2 cubits by 8 cubits, which would be the exact size of the shroud, which would be very long, very unusual. A burial cloth that expensive would have to belong to an extremely well-to-do individual that had money to burn, that he would have that kind of burial cloth ready to go. Could this be something that a 14th century counterfeiter would put together and send away for? Just think about it. The guy wants to counterfeit and trick everybody that this is the shroud of Jesus. He knew enough to send away for an expensive first century 2 cubic by 8 cubic shroud? That seems unlikely, doesn't it? Also, now we have this all forensic evidence and stuff that we can do. Yep, limestone that was found on the shroud is something that is generally only found around Jerusalem. So Joseph Colbeck and Richard Levy, they looked at this and found travertine, agranite, limestone particles in the samples that were taken, and using chemical spectra data, right, using these lights and other things, breaking it down by the chemicals and by this spectral data, identified this as absolute proof that the shroud was either in contact with this kind of limestone or the limestone was brought to the shroud. And again, this is highly unlikely that any forger would know to go to Israel and to get limestone from that area. He wouldn't even know that we would have the ability that anybody could tell limestone apart at that time. So it just seems unlikely if this is a forger. And then here we go, just like CSI. And I used to make fun of CSI when they would say, we found pollen that only originates. I'm like, really? Does that really happen? Yeah, I guess it does. So they found this pollen, Gundalia tunaforte. Hopefully I'm saying that right. It grows, guess where? Only in Israel, mostly around Jerusalem. And guess what? They found it mostly around the head area on the shroud. And yes, it's going to blow your mind, but this plant is a very thorny plant. The thorns grow to about 1 inch long. And what did they put on top of Jesus' head? But a thorny crown, right? They found pollen that matches that on the shroud. It's just amazing. So if you look at the shroud, experts have identified the shroud as a 5 foot, 10-inch male because of the blood work they've done, because of the DNA and all the imaging that they can do and facial recognition and all this stuff that they can do. They say the pathology and the ethnicity, they're saying this is a male 30 to 35 years old, about 175 pounds. He's about 5'10", and this individual was crucified. They can tell that because of a couple things. The pectoral muscles seemed very high on the body, so they're shortened. But that happens when you're hanging on a cross for so long. And then especially afterwards when you die that way and rigor mortis sets in, that your skin kind of seizes up in that place where you were when you died. So they're saying just so many different things. And this, I know we're going long, but there's so much to go through. Now, the other thing that they look at is that there's wounds in the hands here. And it's about the area of the wrist. Now, all the paintings and depictions before the shroud was seen in 544, what they believe is a shroud, had the holes in the hands. And you would say, well, it says it's in the hands. But in the Greek, that extends up into the wrist. And we know now by finding some individuals' corpses that were crucified and the information we have that they actually, if they put the nail in your hand, it's not going to hold you up. They have to put it in your wrist so that the bone structure in your tendons there will actually hold your body weight. Now, would a forger know this in the 13th or 14th century? They didn't, because all the paintings before that and what they thought before was that it was in the hands just by reading the Bible that they had or what they were told. And we begin to see, and here's the close-up of the nail holes, and it's farther back in right around the wrist area, right at the edge, and that's generally where they would crucify a person. So let's look at the difference. This person was fits the biblical account that Jesus has. Matthew 27, 29, and 30 says that they twisted the crown of thorns and put it around his head, and that they beat him with a reed about the head, which would put huge punctures, right, and tear up your skin. Now, the blood in this image shows up lighter because it's like the negative of negative, if you follow what I'm saying. And so this is blood that's coming that would have come out and stained the shroud. And you can see it around there, and you can see it dripping down on the sides of the hair. And that you would have had something similar to puncture marks that the crown of thorns would leave. It also says that they beat him, they blindfolded him, and beat him about the face. They plucked his beard. Right? Isaiah 50 verse 6 says that they struck him about the cheeks and plucked out his beard. In Mark 14:65, it says they spat on him, blindfolded him, said prophesy, and beat him with their hands. And so when we look here and we do a ISO density picture where the blood then is red, and this is one of their specialized pictures. So what does it show up? It shows that this individual had a mouse under his eye. In other words, he had a bruise that was already starting to fill up, and basically fat lip and probably a split lip, and the blood that's running down from the head into the eyebrows and from the nose into the mustache, which would have meant that he probably had his nose broken. Remember, no bone was broken on, but your nose is cartilage. It's not a bone. That's why you don't see a nose on skeletons. And that you can see area where his beard is plucked. This individual who's in the shroud, not only did he have blood dripping down to the front of his beard, probably from a broken nose, but all along there he has where his beard would be, where it wouldn't impact and probably cut him by the whip, but it would if you plucked or pulled out the beard. The image on the back of the shroud is very clear, and you see that the back of the back is not flayed out in the sense of spaced out. This will be interesting later on. I'm just trying to point that out. But you can see whip marks, but you also see like very heavy scratching up around the shoulder area, which would be, they took Jesus and they scourged him, right? But he went out of the place and he had to carry his cross with him, which would have been either a beam or likely drag the cross. It was most likely a beam that you carried, and then they just hooked that up on the cross that was already permanently in the ground, and they believe that's the way that the Romans did this. So you see scratch marks, which is consistent with carrying a heavy beam or something like that, and Roman whip marks. And I want to take a closer look at this. Not is it just whip marks, but it fits exactly in John 1:19 or 19:1. It says that so Pilate took Jesus and scourged him. And now we know that the Roman flagrum whip was, and we now have a few of them that survived over all this time, and we know exactly what they look like. And they had sometimes bones and stuff in them, but they all have in common that they have these like tiny ball bearings at the end. So when they whip you, just think of the centrifugal force. So they put this on the end because the whip would come down so much harder if you have weights at the end of the whip. And let me bring this up so that you can see that these ball bearings at the end of this leather fit exactly the blood stains and bruises, most likely blood stains, that we see on the shroud, on the individual. You can see the whipping, you can see these points, and I'm pointing out a few on here, and there's numerous ones, of this flagrum. This person who's in the shroud was whipped with a Roman flagrum. Now, how would a 14th century forger know exactly what that looked like? It just is kind of astonishing. the next slide, we see that the legs of this individual and the bones, none of them seem to be broken. In John 19:31 through 34, it talks about that they came to Jesus, that they didn't break his legs, but they did take a spear and they put it up into the side of the individual. Well, we see on the shroud, we see that a Roman lance, something like a Roman lance, and here's the depiction of a Roman lance, went up into the side of Jesus. Well, we see on the side of the man who's in the shroud that his side was pierced. And it's a very large piercing. So a lance or a very large sword or knife went up into the side of this man and basically cut into him. Now, interesting, you remember in the scripture it says, and here's another type of image that they took, you can see all the markings from the Roman flagrum that came around the body of this individual who was in the shroud. But you can also see the wound in the side, you can see the blood, and you can see the water or the serum. So, and he wouldn't still be bleeding at this time, but I was police chaplain for nearly 2 decades, and I've seen a lot of accident scenes and a lot of dead bodies. And yes, if you move them around like you're carrying them to bury them or do whatever, if they can, for wounds, they can still ooze out or leak blood or, any kind of body fluids that are there. And I'm not trying to gross you out or anything, but in the picture of the shroud, the man in the shroud literally had a large wound in his side that had blood and water. So just, again, is that something? And it's real blood. So somehow the forger had to come up with blood and serum, or blood and water, to be able to forge this thing. And here's another thing that we have. He was buried in a rich man's tomb. That's what happened to Jesus. We also have the limestone from that area. Now, why I bring this up is because anybody who's crucified was just usually thrown into a dirt pile or into Gehenna, into the valley of Henna, and to be burned up. They didn't get an honorable burial. But this individual who was crucified got an honorable burial, and we can verify that with him having the limestone on his back and on the feet. Also, look at this picture. Here's an up-close picture of the hands. And it's not a painting. The hands look exceptionally long, but it's because, and here's what they're thinking. What made this image? It's just cellulose. So what made this image? Look at this image and you can see the elongated fingers. It's not that the fingers are so long, but it looks like an X-ray. You're actually seeing the bones in the hand. Like this is an X-ray. Like the image was produced by light emanating out of the body. And here you can see the finger bones and not the fingers in like an X-ray like quality. It's just amazing. There's something else about this that's unique, because the image was made not of a man lying down, but a man being upright, because of a couple things. Because the image, there's no flattening of the muscle in the back, which once a person dies, their body begins to flatten out on those. You don't have the muscle tension. There's a technical term for it. I forget what it is. But you don't have the muscle tension anymore, and your body just begins to flatten out. And so your back or whatever begins to look kind of like Play-Doh. It just flattens out, and you have no distinctions there. But this person, it's not happened. So they weren't in the burial cloth for very long, and there's no smudge marks in the burial cloth. So, because if you have this person, he's not in there very long, and you would have smudge marks. If you're taking a photo or something, or you're getting this image, and you slide the image out, it's going to mess up your image, right? And so what they think is that the evidence shows that the body was upright in midair when the image was made. And here's why they think that is because in digitized pictures, they notice shadow lines under the pectoral muscles, under the cheekbone, under the eyes, under the knees in certain areas, that it looks like this was raised up. And another reason why and here's a close-up, the shadow under the eyes and under the cheekbone and that. But where's the hair? It's at the side. Now, ladies, when you, or some of you guys, I guess, who have long hair, when you lay down on your back, where does your hair go? Most of it's going to lay back on the pillow, right? When you stand up or sit up, then the hair comes flat around your head, right? When you're laying down, it flays out, and it could be around the other, all across the pillow, right? And so the hair is alongside of the body, and it looks like blood dripped down from the hair above, or from the forehead above onto the hair. And so the hair is flat alongside the head, which means the body was either sitting up, but most likely the body was floating in midair, like beginning to stand up when the image was made. So, okay, I'm going to come to the close. People say, what's the percentage? For me, I'm at 80%. I know this is overwhelming, and I've still got this, like, you don't want to seem like you're gimmicky or quirky. Like, this is absolutely the Shroud of Jesus. I'm just hedging my bets because I don't want to look foolish, but what are the odds? Like, what are the odds? Like, you're going into the parking lot. What are the odds that you're going to have two exact Ford coupes, blue coupes that have the, sticker on the windshield and the bug-eyed headlights and everything else that fits it? You're like, yeah, the odds of that happening are starting to get pretty high, right? And we've gotten over incredible odds of Jesus, right? Of things like, let me just go through it. A man in his early 30s, his ethnicity is that he's a most likely Middle Eastern man, probably a Jew, that he did have his beard plucked. He was beaten in the face. He was crowned with thorns from a bush that is only found in Israel, mostly around Jerusalem. He was brutally scourged with a Roman flagrum. He was crucified. He had a large stab wound in his side. That stab wound produced blood and serum. He had no broken bones. He had he had a rich man's burial around Jerusalem. The burial was done hastily. There's no decomposition in the body, and the body wasn't removed from the shroud just because there's no smears or blood smears or whatever. And so this, when you look at this and you begin to put this together, and somebody did this, some statistician did this, and I wish I could give him credit, but here's the odds that the image could be someone other than Jesus. It's the most conservative estimate is 1 in 225 billion that this could be someone else other than Jesus. So what it comes down to this: Jesus said, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live." You have to decide. I'm at 80%, man. I just really do think this is there. I'm open to other evidence that would prove me wrong. That's why I'm 80% and not 100%. And I don't know if I could be 100%. And I wish I could examine it personally up close. But in all the evidence and talking to the scientists, some of the scientists that did and looked at it and looking at their evidence and their conclusion, I'm just blown away. And it's not a forgery. We don't know what it is, but it's not paint. It's not heat transference. It's not done through sunlight. It's cellulose that was produced somehow brilliantly in great detail by radiation or some type of immense glow or light, kind of like the Mount of Transfiguration. And so that's amazing. Hey, thanks for sticking with me this whole time. If you like this video, maybe you subscribe, give us a like. If you didn't like the video, go ahead and hit the like button. And thanks for checking out this video, and God bless you.